The Declaration of Independence ruined nations and lives, and the story we tell about it is the most successful act of national forgetting or amnesia in American history. Did you know that in the events that led up to the Declaration of Independence of 1776, independence wasn't the first goal? Most Americans didn't want it. Remember, they were Englishmen. The Civil War and its parallel war for independence was America's longest-running war until Vietnam, and proportionally one of its deadliest. It was bankrolled by a king in France, which led to his downfall. Who was hurt the least? Britain. Britain would go on to becoming the world's first global superpower by 1850, which lasted through the First World War. But this is a story of 1776 as a civil war, the one America conveniently forgot that it fought against itself. For the first year of fighting after Lexington, after Bunker Hill, the colonists insisted they were loyal subjects seeking their rights as Englishmen. Congress sent the olive branch petition to George III in July of 1775, months into the shooting war. Independence only became the cause in 1776, driven by Paine's common sense. What we call the founding ideal was, in 1774, a fringe position. Most Americans never signed on. Roughly 20% of Americans, the loyalists, didn't want to break from Britain. Again, they were British. About 40% were neutral. Again, they were British too, keeping their heads down. Independence was forced by, at best, 40% of the population at the time, what we call Patriots. And within that, the ones actually driving events were a far smaller activist core of committee men and soldiers. The most consequential decision in American history was never backed by a majority. This wasn't a united people versus a foreign king. It was Americans versus Americans. The Revolution was America's first civil war. Britain wouldn't formally recognize the U.S. as an independent nation until 7 years after the Declaration, or in 1783. It was a dirty war. The Patriots suppressed the press and rigged the debate. Loyalist printers had their shops destroyed by mobs. Committees of inspection examined private conduct, published dissenters' names in papers so they'd be universally condemned, forced public recantations, loyalty oaths became mandatory, refusal could cost you your property. The revolution for free speech was not conducted under free speech. Again, these were Englishmen upon Englishmen. We now call them Americans upon Americans, but again, they were Englishmen in a civil war amongst themselves. And freedom didn't extend to the slaves. The hypocrisy was visible at the time. Samuel Johnson in 1775 wrote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" The Declaration proclaims all men created equal, but it was written by a man who enslaved hundreds of people. And women kept the colonies running while it fought the British. What did they get? Nothing. The boycotts and farms that sustained the cause depended on women's household production. Abigail Adams asked John to remember, John Adams, to remember the ladies. He laughed it off. New Jersey briefly let property-owning women vote, then took it away in 1807. The war was longer and deadlier than remembered. 8 years. Again, America's longest war until Vietnam. Roughly 1 in 100 Americans died. Scaled to today's population, that's over 3 million deaths. And most died not in battle, but of disease, and in British prison ships in New York Harbor, which killed more Americans, between 8,000 and 11,000, than all the battles combined. Now, wealthy families could ransom their kids back. The poor could not. After the patriotic rush of 1775 faded, the continental ranks filled with the poor, the landless, the indentured, men fighting for bounties and land grants, while the propertied Englishmen bought substitutes. A rich man's cause, a poor man's fight, just like Russia and Ukraine today. And the army nearly dissolved repeatedly. Chronic desertion, expiring enlistments, outright mutinies in Pennsylvania and New Jersey in 1781. And in 1783, the Newburgh Conspiracy, unpaid officers flirting with turning the army on Congress. The citizen soldier myth papers over an army that hated its own government almost as much as the enemy. Again, there's a civil war. And then there's the land motive. Britain's proclamation line of 1763 barred settlement west of the Appalachians to keep peace with the natives, or native nations, I should say, blocking claims held by speculators, including Washington and Franklin. The Quebec Act of 1774 seemed to extinguish those Western claims for good. The Declaration itself protests both and denounces, quote, merciless Indian savages, which in plain terms means the king won't help us take their land. Sound familiar today when Israel, Gaza, etc.? Virtually the first thing the new nation did was organize Western lands for sale and settlement, the Land Ordinance of 1785, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and begin wars against the Ohio nations that the Crown had restrained. For Native America, that's what the Revolutionary War was to them, the removal of the imperial brake on settler expansion. Every expansionist movement in history has had its true believers and its speculators. When we watch settler expansion anywhere in the world today, including the West Bank and Gaza, it's worth asking the 1776 question. How much of the ideology is conviction, and how much is real estate? The Declaration would have remained a piece of paper without France, money, muskets, gunpowder troops, and above all, the Navy. Yorktown was decided by a French fleet winning a sea battle with no Americans present. And France didn't do it for love of liberty. It did it to poke its arch enemy Britain in the eye after the humiliation of 1763. The war roughly doubled France's debt. By the late 1780s, half the crown's revenue went to debt service. The fiscal crisis forced Louis XVI to summon the Estates General in 1789, and the monarchy that bought American independence was devoured by its own revolution. Louis went to the guillotine in 1793, a decade after his money won the war. The Patriots were, from London's view, foreign-funded insurgents, and the funding destroyed the funder. How ironic. France's real error wasn't the money. It was pursuing a geopolitical grudge whose benefits went abroad while the costs stayed home. Again, think about Israel. Today, a question for America isn't literally, will aid to Israel bankrupt us? It can't. The sums are too small. But the question is a France question. Which of our commitments to Israel deliver benefits to someone else while the costs, fiscal, political, moral, compound at home? Anyway, France won the war, but lost its regime. Britain was no saint. It armed and organized tens of thousands of loyalists, promised protection, but largely left them to the fate at the peace. Some 60,000 loyalists, plus roughly 50,000 of their slaves, fled to Canada, Britain, and the Caribbean. Most loyalists, though, stayed, took the oaths, and melted silently back into the population, which is partly why their grandchildren's school books could tell the story of a united people everyone wanted to forget. Now, getting back to today. Is there a straight line from the loyalists of 1783 to the Afghan interpreters of 2021 and the Kurds? Does any great power ever pay its local allies in full? And the uncomfortable extension. Every ally believes it's too important to abandon. The loyalists certainly did. Is any ally ever really too big to abandon? Of course, I'm talking about Israel. Israel's could learn a lot reading about America's first civil war. Who won? Who lost? Who paid? Who didn't? Some final twists. The 1780s brought depression, worthless currency, and Shays' Rebellion, revolutionary veterans taking up arms against the debt courts of the new republic. The first governing arrangement collapsed. The Constitution exists because the Revolution's first attempt at a country failed. The founding wasn't a moment, it was a decade of near misses. The second twist: Britain won by losing. Independence didn't wound Britain, it freed it. Adam Smith argued in 1776, the same year, that the colonies cost more than they returned, and he was right. Trade with independent America grew beyond colonial levels. Within 20 years of Yorktown, Britain was beating Napoleon. By 1850, it was the unchallengeable global superpower, producing a fifth of the world's manufacturing with 2% of its population. Losing America was a prelude to Britain's greatest century. Britain arguably profited from losing. So, a war most Americans didn't want, forced by a minority, enforced by mobs and committees, fought by the poor, paid for by a doomed French king, the expelled 60,000 people, opened a continent to conquest, and barely dented the empire it was aimed at. Why don't we know this story? Because the losers left, taking their version to Canada. Because a new nation needed a myth of unanimity, and because 1861 took the words Civil War for itself. Bottom line, the Declaration of Independence was not a clean fight for freedom many Americans believe it was. It was a civil war, a bitter one, dirty and deceitful. The Founding Fathers aren't people to look up to. They are people who made mistakes we should fear.